The information provided in this video is for educational and historical purposes only, and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical or mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen in this presentation. Imagine it's 1955. You're 24 years old. Maybe you've been feeling a crushing sadness you can't explain. Maybe you hear voices others don't. Or maybe you've just done something that embarrassed your powerful family. One day a doctor visits. He speaks with your parents in hushed tones. Before you know it, you're in a car watching your home disappear in the rearview mirror. You arrive at a colossal brick building, a sprawling campus with manicured lawns and barred windows, set far away from the city. They call it a state hospital, an asylum. You're told it's for your own good, a place to rest, to get better. But as the heavy oak doors close behind you with a deafening thud, a terrifying thought creeps in. You might never leave. For over 500,000 Americans at the peak of the institutional era, this wasn't a scene from a horror movie. It was their reality. In 1955, more than 1 out of every 300 people in the United States was a patient in a public psychiatric hospital. 500,000 souls living behind those walls. Today, that number is less than 40,000. We went from warehousing human beings on an industrial scale to a system that looks completely different. So the question is, what happened? Where did all those people go? Was it a heroic revolution of civil rights and miracle drugs that liberated the suffering? Or was it one of the most disastrous, short-sighted social experiments in American history? One that traded one nightmare for another? The answer is, it was both. And understanding this story, this seismic shift from the asylum to the community, is the single most important key to understanding modern America. If you have ever walked through a major American city and wondered about the homelessness crisis, this story is for you. If you've ever been shocked to learn that the largest mental health providers in our country today are not hospitals, but prisons like Rikers Island and the Cook County Jail, this story is for you. If you want to understand the roots of the opioid epidemic, the debates over involuntary commitment, and the crushing weight on millions of families dealing with mental illness today, then you have to understand how we got here. And to do that, we have to go back to a time when the asylum wasn't a place of horror, but a beacon of hope. It's almost impossible for us to imagine now, but the creation of the American asylum system was born from a profoundly optimistic, even utopian, ideal. Before the 1800s, there was no system. The severely mentally ill were treated like criminals or outcasts. They were hidden in basements by ashamed families, left to wander the countryside as vagrants, or thrown into squalid, terrifying jails and almshouses, often chained to walls in filth, treated worse than animals. They were seen as cursed, possessed, or simply broken beyond repair. Then came a revolution in thinking. A new idea, imported from Europe, called moral treatment. The concept was radical for its time. That mental illness wasn't a moral failing or a demonic possession, but a disease of the mind that could be cured. And the cure wasn't chains or beatings, it was compassion. It was a peaceful, structured environment, fresh air, good food, meaningful work, and kindness. The thinking was that if you removed a person from the chaotic stresses of modern life that supposedly broke their mind, and placed them in a serene, orderly sanctuary, their sanity could be restored. This was the birth of the asylum. The word itself, asylum, means sanctuary, a place of safety and refuge. The first American asylums were built to be just that. Architects designed them to look like college campuses or country estates, with beautiful rolling landscapes, grand verandas, and sun-drenched rooms. They were intentionally built far from the grime and noise of the industrializing cities. Patients were called patients, not inmates. They worked on hospital farms, tended gardens, learned crafts, and participated in plays and concerts. The goal wasn't just to contain them, it was to cure them. And no single person embodied this crusade more than a quiet, determined schoolteacher from Massachusetts named Dorothea Dix. In 1841, Dix volunteered to teach a Sunday school class at the East Cambridge Jail. What she saw there horrified her and changed the course of American history. She found mentally ill individuals locked in unheated, lightless cells, naked, filthy, and chained. They were flogged, starved, and treated with a brutality that shocked her to her core. For the next 40 years, Dorothea Dix became a force of nature. She traveled tens of thousands of miles across the country, meticulously documenting the horrific conditions in every jail and poorhouse she could find. She was a brilliant and relentless lobbyist. She would present her detailed, gut-wrenching findings, her memorials, to state legislatures, shaming them with the unvarnished truth. Her voice, calm but unyielding, demanded that the state take responsibility for its most vulnerable citizens. And it worked. Responding to her crusade, state after state appropriated massive sums of money to build these new grand asylums. She was personally responsible for the founding of more than 30 hospitals for the mentally ill. It was a monumental achievement, a testament to the idea that government could and should act with compassion. The United States was building a nationwide system of care from scratch, founded on the noble dream of moral treatment. But a dream, no matter how noble, can curdle into a nightmare when it collides with reality. And the reality was that this grand vision had a fatal flaw. The very success of Dorothea Dix's crusade planted the seeds of its own destruction. The states had been convinced to build the hospitals, but they were never truly convinced to pay for what it actually cost to run them. The beautiful buildings went up, but the funding for staff, for programs, for the actual treatment was always a political battle, and it was a battle the hospitals usually lost. At the same time, the country was being transformed by waves of immigration, rapid industrialization, and explosive urban growth. The population was booming, and so were the social problems that came with it. Poverty, alcoholism, and disease were rampant in the teeming cities. And the asylums, the brand new places of refuge, quickly became the solution for everything. They became human dumping grounds. Families who couldn't cope with an elderly parent with dementia, a rebellious teenager, or a relative with epilepsy had a place to send them. Sheriffs who didn't want to deal with a town drunk or a hysterical woman had a place to send them. The patient population began to skyrocket, far beyond what the hospitals were ever designed to handle. A hospital built for 250 patients would soon be crammed with 1,000, then 2,000, then 5,000. The dream of a serene therapeutic community vanished. The individual attention that moral treatment required became impossible. One doctor might be responsible for hundreds or even thousands of patients. The staff were underpaid, undertrained, and completely overwhelmed. The beautiful campuses became vast, overcrowded warehouses. The grand experiment, born of such high hopes, was beginning to fail. And in the dark, crowded wards of these crumbling institutions, a desperate search for a new kind of cure was about to begin. A cure that didn't require time or compassion or money. A cure that could be administered quickly, cheaply, and to the masses. The age of moral treatment was dying. The age of the ice pick lobotomy, insulin coma therapy, and electroshock was about to be born. To understand what came next, you have to understand the pressure. Imagine you're a doctor in a state asylum in the 1930s. Your hospital, built for 500 people, now houses 3,000. Patients are sleeping in hallways, on floors. The budget is non-existent. The promise of moral treatment, of kindness and rest, has drowned in a sea of human misery. You have hundreds of patients suffering from severe schizophrenia, catatonia, debilitating depression. Their families are desperate. Society wants them hidden away. And you have nothing. No effective treatments. No real answers. You are a warden of a human warehouse, not a healer. So when a new idea comes along, a radical idea, a heroic intervention that promises not just management, but a cure, you listen. The first whispers of hope came from an unlikely source. An accident. In Vienna, a physician named Manfred Sockel was treating patients addicted to morphine. He was using insulin to manage withdrawal symptoms, but one day he accidentally gave a patient an overdose. The patient slipped into a deep coma, then woke up hours later, and claimed his withdrawal cravings were gone. A light bulb went off in Sockel's head. What if a coma could act as a reset button? What if you could reboot the entire human brain? He turned his attention to schizophrenia. The theory was that by injecting massive doses of insulin, you could plunge a patient into a hypoglycemic coma. Their body would convulse, they'd stop breathing, teetering on the very edge of death. Then, after an hour, you bring them back with a glucose solution. The process was repeated day after day for weeks. It was incredibly dangerous. Mortality rates were as high as 10% in some hospitals. But for a desperate medical community, it seemed to work. Patients who had been catatonic for years were suddenly lucid. They were talking. They were calm. Insulin coma therapy became the first widely adopted shock treatment. It was a brutal, life-threatening ordeal, but for the first time in a long time, there was a flicker of something that looked like progress. That flicker ignited a fire. If shocking the body into a coma could work, what else could? A Hungarian neuropsychiatrist named Ladislas Meduna had a theory. He'd made an observation, a deeply flawed one it turns out, that people with epilepsy rarely seem to develop schizophrenia. He concluded, incorrectly, that the seizures of epilepsy were somehow antagonistic to the psychosis of schizophrenia. His solution: if the patient doesn't have seizures, we'll give them seizures. He found a chemical called metrazole, a powerful circulatory and respiratory stimulant that, in high enough doses, induced violent, terrifying convulsions. The effects were immediate and horrific. Patients would feel a sense of impending doom, a terror so profound they would scream, "I'm dying!" just before the seizure hit. The convulsions were so powerful that they would fracture spines, break femurs, and shatter teeth. Nurses would have to hold patients down with all their strength to prevent them from literally breaking themselves apart on the hospital bed. And yet, some patients did show improvement. The terror and the trauma seemed to jolt them out of their psychosis, at least for a while. Metrazole therapy was faster and cheaper than insulin comas, and it spread through American asylums like wildfire. But even its proponents knew it was barbaric. They needed a better way to induce the seizure, a way to do it without the bone-breaking violence and the psychological terror. The answer came from Italy. In Rome, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini were experimenting with using electric shocks to study epilepsy in dogs. They had a thought: what if they applied the electrodes not to a dog but to a human head? Their first human subject was a 39-year-old man found wandering and incoherent at the Rome train station. They strapped him down, placed electrodes on his temples, and delivered the first jolt of electricity. The man's muscles seized, and he reportedly shouted out in a garbled voice, "Not another one! It's deadly!" The doctors, shaken but determined, ignored his plea and administered a higher voltage. The man's body arched in a massive grand mal seizure. He blacked out. When he awoke, he was calm and lucid. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was born. It was cleaner, more controllable, and seen as more humane than metrazole. It quickly replaced chemical shock therapy and became a staple of the asylum. But it was still a crude instrument, administered without muscle relaxants or proper anesthesia, causing memory loss and fear. All of these treatments, insulin comas, chemical shocks, electroshock, were attempts to fix the brain from the outside. They were about shaking the system, rebooting it, hoping it would come back online in a better state. But what if you could go inside? What if, instead of shaking the machine, you could just cut the wire that was causing the problem? This was the thinking of a Portuguese neurologist named Agos Muniz. In 1935, he heard about a study where chimpanzees who were frustrated and aggressive became calm and docile after having the frontal lobes of their brains surgically damaged. For Muniz, it was a revelation. He theorized that in people with severe mental illness, thoughts became stuck in rigid, obsessive circuits in the frontal lobe. The solution, he believed, was simple: sever those connections. He developed a procedure called a leucotomy, where he would drill holes into the side of a patient's skull and inject pure alcohol into the frontal lobes to destroy the tissue. He later refined this by creating an instrument called a leucotome, a long cannula with a retractable wire loop to cut out cores of brain matter. The results were mixed. Yes, patients were calmer. Their anxiety, their agitation, their violent outbursts often vanished. But so did everything else. Their personalities were flattened. They were left apathetic, emotionally blunted, and intellectually vacant. They were easier to manage, but a fundamental part of their humanity had been carved away. Despite this, in a world desperate for any solution, Muniz's procedure was hailed as a miracle. In 1949, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine, and that Nobel Prize caught the attention of an ambitious American neurologist and showman named Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman saw Muniz's leucotomy not as a last resort, but as a revolution. He believed it held the key to emptying the nation's overflowing asylums. But he thought drilling holes in the skull was too slow, too complicated, too surgical. He wanted something faster, cheaper, something he could do not in an operating room but in his office, something he could take on the road. He found his inspiration in his own kitchen. In an ice pick, Freeman developed a new procedure, the transorbital lobotomy. He believed he could access the frontal lobes without drilling through the thick bone of the skull. He could go through the eye sockets. His method was shockingly simple and brutal. He would have the patient lie down, often just using electroshock as anesthesia. He would then take a long, sharp instrument, literally modeled after an ice pick, and insert it above the patient's eyeball, into the corner of the eye socket. With a mallet, he would tap the end of the ice pick, driving it through the thin layer of bone and into the frontal lobes of the brain. Then he would swish the pick back and forth like a windshield wiper, severing the connections. Then he'd pull it out and do the other eye. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. Walter Freeman became a missionary for the ice pick lobotomy. He bought a van, which he nicknamed his Lobotomobile, and drove it across the country from one state asylum to the next, performing dozens of lobotomies a day. He was a performer. He'd sometimes use 2 ice picks at once, one in each hand, to be more efficient. He performed the procedure on housewives suffering from depression, on soldiers with PTSD, on rebellious teenagers. He even performed it on Howard Dully, a 12-year-old boy whose stepmother found him defiant. Freeman's most famous patient and victim was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. The procedure, meant to calm her mood swings, left her with the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to walk or speak intelligibly for the rest of her life. Between the late 1930s and the 1950s, an estimated 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States. Freeman himself performed over 3,400 of them. He wasn't a monster in his own mind. He was a savior. He genuinely believed he was liberating people from the torment of mental illness and freeing up beds in the hopelessly crowded asylums. But what he was actually doing was creating a generation of ghosts, placid, manageable bodies whose minds, whose souls, had been surgically extinguished. This was the apex of institutional medicine's desperation. A search for a physical cure for a spiritual and psychological ailment had led to the physical destruction of the brain itself. The asylum was no longer a place of treatment or even just confinement. It had become a workshop, where the very essence of a person could be cut away with an ice pick. Publicly, these were medical miracles. But inside the asylum walls, the patients and the few nurses who still cared knew the truth. And whispers of that truth were finally starting to escape. The era of the ice pick and the electrode was about to face a reckoning, one that would come not from a scalpel, but from a small, unassuming pill. It arrived not with a bang, but in a bottle. In 1952, a French pharmaceutical company synthesized a compound called chlorpromazine. It was initially developed as an anesthetic, a way to calm patients before surgery. But doctors noticed a peculiar side effect. It didn't just sedate people. It seemed to quiet the very storms raging inside their minds. Patients who had been lost to violent delusions, who screamed at unseen demons, who were trapped in the terrifying labyrinth of psychosis, suddenly became calm. They became reachable. When it was brought to the United States under the brand name Thorazine, it was hailed as a miracle. It was dubbed the chemical lobotomy, a name that, while chilling today, was seen as a godsend at the time. It offered the same outcome promised by the ice pick. A docile, manageable patient, but without the brutal, irreversible destruction of brain tissue. It didn't cure schizophrenia or psychosis, not by a long shot. But it suppressed the most severe symptoms. It put a muzzle on the hallucinations. It turned down the volume on the terrifying inner chaos, allowing a flicker of the person underneath to shine through. For the first time in a century, there was a tool that could do more than just restrain or shock. It could treat. And this single development changed everything. The very foundation of the asylum system began to crack. For decades, the logic of the asylum was containment. Society had no answer for severe mental illness, so the answer was to build a wall around it, to lock it away where it couldn't be seen or heard. But if a pill could make a patient manageable, if it could allow them to function, then what was the point of the wall? What was the purpose of these enormous, decaying, and fantastically expensive institutions? Suddenly, a new idea, a radical idea, began to take hold: deinstitutionalization. It was a concept born from a perfect storm of factors. First, you had the new drugs, the antipsychotics, which offered the promise of managing patients outside of an institution. Second, you had the growing public horror. The stories of neglect, the exposés of abuse, the whispers of lobotomies and electroshock gone wrong, they were finally reaching the mainstream. The public was beginning to see asylums not as hospitals, but as prisons. And third, perhaps most powerfully, you had the economic argument. State governments were drowning under the financial weight of these massive institutions. They were a black hole for taxpayer money, with ever-growing patient populations and crumbling infrastructure. The idea of closing them down, of shifting the burden of care away from the state and onto something else, was incredibly appealing to politicians on both sides of the aisle. They saw a win-win scenario. They could be hailed as compassionate reformers freeing the oppressed, while also slashing millions from the state budget. It was an irresistible combination of moral righteousness and fiscal pragmatism. But this grand idea, this national shift in consciousness, needed a champion. It needed a voice powerful enough to turn a concept into a revolution. And that voice would come from the highest office in the land, motivated by a secret personal tragedy that had haunted America's most famous family for decades. In 1941, long before he was a senator or a president, John F. Kennedy was just a young man watching his vibrant, beautiful older sister, Rosemary, struggle. Rosemary Kennedy was not like the other Kennedy children. She was slower to learn, prone to mood swings, and as she entered her 20s, her behavior became more volatile and difficult for the family to manage. Her father, Joseph Kennedy, a man obsessed with power and public image, saw his daughter's condition as a threat to the family's political ambitions. He feared a scandal that could derail his sons' careers. So, in secret, he consulted with Walter Freeman, the very same doctor who had perfected the ice pick lobotomy. Freeman told him the procedure could calm Rosemary, make her more agreeable. And so, at just 23 years old, Rosemary Kennedy was subjected to a prefrontal lobotomy. The result was an absolute catastrophe. The procedure left her with the mental capacity of a toddler. She was unable to walk or speak coherently, and would spend the rest of her life hidden away in a private institution, her existence all but erased from the Kennedy family story. John F. Kennedy loved his sister, and though the family never spoke of it publicly, the silent tragedy of Rosemary's fate weighed on him deeply. He had witnessed firsthand the catastrophic failure of the institutional system. He had seen how medicine, in its arrogance and ignorance, could destroy a life rather than save it. He knew the desperation that led a family to make such a devastating choice. When he became president, this personal pain fueled a public mission. He was determined to change the system that had failed his sister so completely. In February 1963, Kennedy delivered a special message to Congress, a speech that would change the course of American mental health care forever. He was the first and only president to make mental health a central focus of his administration. He spoke of the sad neglect of the mentally ill, calling for a bold new approach. He painted a grim picture of the state asylums, describing them as places where thousands of patients were shunted off to custodial institutions, where hope was lost. He argued that these institutions were a relic of a less enlightened time. "We need a new type of health facility," he declared, one which will return mental health care to the mainstream of American medicine, and at the same time upgrade mental health services. His vision was clear and powerful. Instead of warehousing people in massive, isolated institutions, he proposed a network of community-based mental health centers. These would be local clinics where people could get treatment, psychotherapy, medication, counseling, while still living at home, holding a job, and being part of their community. It was a revolutionary idea, to treat mental illness not as a life sentence to be served behind brick walls, but as a condition to be managed within the fabric of society. On October 31, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act into law. It was the final piece of major legislation he would ever sign. With the stroke of his pen, he authorized federal funding to build a nationwide network of these community centers. He declared that with this act, the nation was reversing the process of institutionalization and replacing the cold mercy of custodial care with the hopeful warmth of community concern. It felt like a monumental victory, a triumph of science, compassion, and political will. The age of the asylum was officially over. The doors of these colossal institutions were about to be thrown open, and hundreds of thousands of patients, medicated and stabilized by the new miracle drugs, would be released from the shadows and welcomed back into the light of society. The promise was a brighter future, a more humane system, and the end of a century of suffering. But a promise is not a reality. A law on paper is not the same as a clinic on a street corner. Kennedy's vision was beautiful, but he wouldn't be there to see it through. And as the asylum gates began to swing open, a critical question went unanswered. What exactly were these people being released to? The plan was to build a safety net of 1,000 community centers. But what if they were never built? What happens when you tear down the old walls before you've even laid the foundation for the new ones? The nation was about to find out. The answer was supposed to be simple, elegant, and humane. 1,500 brand new community mental health centers spread across the nation. A beacon of hope in every neighborhood. These weren't supposed to be mini asylums. They were envisioned as comprehensive hubs of care. You'd have outpatient services, 24-hour emergency care, partial hospitalization for those who needed more support, and education for the community. The idea was to catch mental illness early, to treat it with dignity, and to integrate people back into the fabric of society, not isolate them from it. It was a beautiful, revolutionary dream, a promise whispered to a nation tired of the old horrors. But a promise is only as strong as the will to keep it. Just 1 month after President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act into law, a rifle shot in Dallas changed the course of American history. The act's most powerful champion was gone. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was quickly consumed by the escalating war in Vietnam, a conflict that became a black hole for federal funding. The money that was supposed to build this new world of mental health care was instead being funneled into jungles half a world away. The initial federal funding for the community centers was designed to be seed money only. The plan was for the federal government to help get them started, and then, over time, the states and local communities would take over the financial responsibility. It was a fatal design flaw. Why? Because the states had a massive financial incentive to do the exact opposite. Closing a giant, crumbling, expensive state hospital saved a state budget millions upon millions of dollars. They were offloading a huge fiscal burden. The federal government was supposed to catch the patients with this new safety net. But when the federal money for that net began to dry up, the states didn't step in to weave it themselves. They had already saved the money by closing the asylums. Why would they now spend it on building an entirely new and expensive system of care? It was the ultimate fiscal shell game. The federal government passed the responsibility to the states, and the states, well, they just let it drop. By the mid-1970s, it was clear the dream was dying. Of the 1,500 centers that were promised, less than half were ever built. And many of those that were built were chronically underfunded, understaffed, and completely overwhelmed. They were designed to treat mild to moderate conditions, anxiety, depression, the worried well. They were utterly unprepared for the wave of humanity that was being released from the state hospitals. These were patients with severe, persistent, and complex illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, who had spent decades in institutions. They needed intensive, wraparound services, housing, medication management, vocational training, daily support. What they got was a brochure and a 30-minute appointment scheduled for 6 weeks later. So where did they go? The answer is a national tragedy that unfolds on our streets to this day. They walked out of the asylum gates with a bus ticket in one hand and a small prescription of Thorazine in the other. They were told to find a community center that, for many, didn't exist. They were told to find an apartment, but had no job, no rental history, and no life skills for a world that had moved on without them. They were told to reconnect with families who were often unable or unwilling to care for them. They went to the only places that would take them. They filled the rundown boarding houses and single-room occupancy hotels in the poorest parts of town. They slept in bus stations, in parks, under bridges. The homeless population in America began to explode, and for the first time it had a new face. The person on the street corner muttering to themselves, lost in a world no one else could see. They weren't deinstitutionalized. That word implies a release into a community. What happened was far more cynical. Academics call it transinstitutionalization. It's a cold, clinical term for a brutal reality. We didn't end institutionalization. We just changed the institution. People were moved from one institution, the state mental hospital, to other institutions that were even less equipped to handle them. They were transferred to nursing homes, where an elderly patient population was suddenly mixed with younger individuals with severe psychosis, often with disastrous results. They were moved to adult foster care homes, which were largely unregulated and sometimes horrifically abusive. And most perversely, they were moved into the one system that is legally obligated to never turn anyone away, the criminal justice system. Think about it. A person experiencing a psychotic break, disoriented and frightened, might start shouting in public. Or they might steal a sandwich because they haven't eaten in days. They might trespass while looking for a safe place to sleep. Before, that person might have been taken to a psychiatric hospital. Now they were arrested. A police officer, with little to no mental health training, was suddenly the first responder. The jailhouse became the new emergency room, and the courtroom became the new intake ward. The numbers are staggering and shameful. In 1955, at the peak of the asylum system, there were over 550,000 Americans in state psychiatric hospitals. By the late 1990s, that number had plummeted to around 50,000. During that same period, the number of individuals with severe mental illness in our jails and prisons skyrocketed. Today, the Los Angeles County Jail, Chicago's Cook County Jail, and New York's Rikers Island are, by population, the 3 largest psychiatric facilities in the United States. Let that sink in. Our largest mental health providers are not hospitals. They are jails. This wasn't just a failure of funding. It was a perfect storm, a confluence of forces. Alongside the economic incentives and the promise of new drugs, another powerful movement was gaining steam: the patients' rights and civil liberties movement. Horrified by the abuses in asylums and inspired by the civil rights movement, advocates fought to make it much harder to involuntarily commit someone to a hospital. They argued correctly that mental illness should not be a reason to strip a person of their freedom. Laws were changed across the country, raising the standard for commitment. You could no longer be hospitalized just for being mentally ill. You had to be in imminent danger to yourself or to others. It was a noble and necessary reform, born from the best of intentions. But in the absence of a functioning community care system, it had a devastating unintended consequence. It created a revolving door of tragedy. A person could be floridly psychotic, unable to care for themselves, dying slowly on the streets from exposure and malnutrition, but as long as they weren't actively suicidal or homicidal at that exact moment, it was nearly impossible to get them the help they desperately needed. Families watched in agony as their loved ones deteriorated, unable to legally intervene until they hit rock bottom, which all too often meant an arrest, an overdose, or a funeral. So the old walls had been torn down. The promise of a new foundation was a mirage. The very laws designed to protect the freedom of the mentally ill now, in a cruel twist of irony, condemned many of them to a slow public decline. The system wasn't just broken. It had been dismantled with nothing to replace it. A vacuum was created. And into that vacuum stepped the only institution left with a mandate to deal with the chaos. The police car had replaced the ambulance. The prison warden had replaced the hospital's superintendent. The American prison was about to become the new American asylum, a concrete and steel monument to a well-intentioned dream that had curdled into a nightmare. This new reality wasn't an accident. It was the direct, catastrophic result of a promise that was never kept. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 had painted a beautiful picture: a network of over 2,000 local centers, beacons of hope in every neighborhood. These centers were meant to be the safety net, the soft landing for the hundreds of thousands of people being released from state hospitals. They would offer therapy, medication management, vocational training, and a sense of belonging. It was a vision of compassionate, integrated care. But a vision is not a building. A law is not a budget. The initial federal funding was designed to be seed money, a temporary boost to get the centers up and running. The long-term financial responsibility was then supposed to shift to the states. But the states, having just been relieved of the massive financial burden of their enormous psychiatric hospitals, were in no hurry to take on a new one. The timing couldn't have been worse. The economic stagflation of the 1970s hit state budgets hard. Then came the political shift of the 1980s, a new era of fiscal conservatism and deep cuts to social spending. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981, signed by President Reagan, effectively ended the federal government's direct funding for community mental health services, instead folding it into block grants given to states. States could then use that money for a variety of services, and mental health was often forced to compete with other, more politically popular priorities. The result was a ghost system. Less than half of the promised 2,000 centers were ever built. Those that did open were chronically underfunded, understaffed, and completely overwhelmed. They were equipped to handle what was called the worried well: people with anxiety, mild depression, or marital problems. They were utterly unprepared for the wave of humanity that was coming their way. Individuals with profound, treatment-resistant schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, and complex trauma, many of whom had spent decades institutionalized and had no idea how to navigate the outside world. So where did they go? They walked out of the hospital gates with a bus ticket, a small supply of medication, and a referral to a community center that might not exist, or that had a 6-month waiting list. They ended up in cheap boarding houses, run-down single-room occupancy hotels, or with families who were just as unprepared to care for them as the state was. For thousands, the final destination was the street. This is the moment when the modern crisis of mass homelessness in America truly begins. Before the 1970s, you did not see sprawling encampments in major cities. You did not see legions of people sleeping on grates and in doorways. Deinstitutionalization didn't create homelessness on its own, but it flooded the streets with the single most vulnerable population imaginable. These were people whose illnesses made it nearly impossible to hold a job, maintain an apartment, or even manage daily tasks. Their symptoms, paranoia, disorganized thoughts, auditory hallucinations, were not met with compassion or care. They were met with fear, with annoyance, with police calls. And that is when the criminalization began. Society, having rejected the medical model of the asylum, didn't replace it with the promised community care model. Instead, it defaulted to the only other system it had for managing difficult and disruptive people, the criminal justice system. Suddenly, the symptoms of severe mental illness were relabeled as crimes. A person experiencing a psychotic break and shouting at unseen voices wasn't sick. They were disturbing the peace. A paranoid individual trying to sleep in an abandoned building wasn't homeless. They were trespassing. A person with mania exhibiting erratic behavior wasn't in crisis. They were resisting arrest. This process has a name: transinstitutionalization. It's a clinical-sounding word for a brutal human tragedy. It means we didn't actually end institutionalization. We just changed the institution. We moved people from a hospital ward to a prison cell. And the numbers tell a story more damning than any anecdote. As the state hospital population plummeted from its peak of over 500,000 in the 1950s, the prison and jail population began its historic, terrifying climb. Today, the three largest psychiatric facilities in the United States are not hospitals. They are the Los Angeles County Jail, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York City. At any given moment, there are 10 times more people with serious mental illness in our jails and prisons than in our state hospitals. Think about what that means. We took people from a system that was, for all its monstrous flaws, at least nominally designed to provide treatment, and we put them into a system designed exclusively for punishment. A modern American prison is a sensory nightmare for a healthy mind. For a mind struggling with psychosis or severe depression, it is a torture chamber. The deafening noise, the constant threat of violence, the arbitrary cruelty, the social isolation. It's a perfect environment to exacerbate every possible symptom of mental illness. And the ultimate weapon of the prison, solitary confinement, becomes the ultimate horror. Imagine being locked in a concrete box the size of a parking space for 23 hours a day. Now imagine doing it while voices are screaming in your head, while paranoia convinces you the guards are trying to poison your food, while a crushing depression makes every breath feel like a monumental effort. This isn't treatment. It's the deliberate destruction of a human mind. Correctional officers who signed up to be guards, not psychiatric nurses, are given an impossible task. They are asked to manage the most complex and severe psychiatric cases with only 2 tools: a pair of handcuffs and a can of pepper spray. Their interactions with mentally ill inmates often escalate quickly, leading to violence, punishment, and further deterioration of the inmate's condition. It creates a vicious cycle of crisis, punishment, and deeper crisis. The dream of deinstitutionalization was to give people with mental illness their freedom, to restore their civil rights, to let them live with dignity in the community. But for hundreds of thousands of Americans, that dream of freedom became a long, slow walk from a hospital bed to a homeless shelter to the back of a police car and, finally, to the cold floor of a jail cell. We didn't solve the problem of the American asylum. We just outsourced it. We subcontracted it to the police, to the courts, to the prisons. We hid the problem behind razor wire and called it justice. The great irony is that in tearing down the old asylums in the name of human rights, we inadvertently built new ones with no doctors, no therapy, and no pretense of healing. We had simply traded one crisis for another, a visible one for one that was much, much harder to see. The freedom they were promised was a lie. 4 tens of thousands of people released from state mental hospitals in the 1960s and 70s, the gates didn't open onto a welcoming community with open arms and robust support systems. They opened onto a void. They were handed a bus ticket, a small prescription, maybe a few dollars, and a vague instruction to check in at a community mental health center that was likely understaffed, overwhelmed, or in some cases didn't even exist yet. The promise of deinstitutionalization was liberation. The reality for so many was abandonment. So where did they all go? Between 1955 and 1994, the number of patients in public mental hospitals in the United States dropped by nearly 500,000 people. That's like the entire population of Atlanta, Georgia, suddenly vanishing from one system. But they didn't vanish. They were simply displaced. This wasn't deinstitutionalization. It was transinstitutionalization, a transfer from one institution to another. And the new institutions were far more brutal. They went from psychiatric wards to homeless shelters, from hospital grounds to lonely, single-room occupancy hotels. From the care of nurses, however flawed, to the custody of overworked police officers. And most critically, they went to prison. To understand how this catastrophic failure happened, we have to look at the beautiful, flawed idea at the heart of the movement: the Community Mental Health Center, or CMHC. The vision, signed into law by President Kennedy, was that a network of these local centers would replace the massive, isolated asylums. They would offer a full spectrum of care: inpatient, outpatient, emergency services, and education. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but it had a fatal flaw. It was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of who it would end up serving. The architects of the CMHC system envisioned it as the primary safety net for the severely mentally ill, the people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe psychosis who were being released from the asylums. But that's not who walked through the doors. Instead, the centers were flooded by what sociologists came to call the worried well. These were people from the community struggling with more common, less severe issues: anxiety, depression, marital problems, life stress. They were articulate, motivated to get help, and relatively easy to treat with talk therapy. From the perspective of an underfunded, overworked clinic, they were the ideal patient. They showed up for appointments. They got better. They made the center's success metrics look great. Meanwhile, the former asylum patients, the very people the system was designed for, were often unable to navigate the bureaucracy. Many suffered from anosognosia, a symptom of their illness that meant they didn't believe they were sick. They were disorganized, sometimes paranoid, and difficult to engage. They missed appointments. They didn't adhere to medication. They were, in short, the most difficult and expensive patients to treat. And so, the path of least resistance won. The system, starved for resources, began to prioritize the worried well, leaving its most vulnerable charges to fend for themselves on the streets. The safety net had been built, but for the people falling from the greatest height, the holes were far too wide. This created the infamous revolving door of the 1980s. A person in the midst of a psychotic break would be arrested for trespassing or disorderly conduct. They'd be taken to a hospital emergency room, held for 72 hours, the maximum allowed for an involuntary psychiatric hold in most states, stabilized with medication, and then discharged. Discharged back to the same street corner, the same chaotic shelter, with a prescription they couldn't afford and a follow-up appointment they were in no condition to keep. Within days or weeks, the cycle would begin again. It was a cruel, expensive, and utterly pointless charade of care. It didn't help the patient, it burdened the hospitals, and it frustrated the police. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. With no functioning civil system to care for the mentally ill, the criminal justice system became the provider of last resort. Police officers with minimal training in mental health became frontline crisis workers. And our jails and prisons became our new asylums. The statistics are staggering and shameful. Today, the three largest mental health providers in the United States are not hospitals. They are the Los Angeles County Jail, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York. A study by the National Sheriff's Association found that on any given day, there are 10 times more people with serious mental illness in American jails and prisons than in state psychiatric hospitals. Think about what that means. We closed the asylums because they were inhumane, because they warehoused people in horrific conditions, stripped them of their rights, and offered little hope of recovery. And what did we replace them with? We replaced them with concrete cells, solitary confinement, and a culture of punishment, not treatment. In prison, mentally ill inmates are more likely to be victims of violence, more likely to be punished for behaviors that are symptoms of their illness, and they often leave in worse condition than when they arrived, now with a criminal record that makes finding housing and employment nearly impossible. We didn't solve the problem. We just hid it behind bars. We criminalized sickness. For a brief moment, it seemed like there was a chance to fix it. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter, whose wife Rosalind was a passionate advocate for mental health, signed the Mental Health Systems Act. It was a visionary piece of legislation designed to finally fulfill the promise of community care, providing federal grants to build the comprehensive support systems that had been missing for 2 decades. It was the last, best hope to correct the course of deinstitutionalization. That hope lasted less than a year. One of the first acts of the incoming Reagan administration in 1981 was the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. It didn't just cut funding for mental health, it fundamentally dismantled the entire federal structure. It repealed Carter's Act and replaced direct federal funding for community mental health centers with block grants to the states. States could now use this federal money for almost anything they wanted, building roads, balancing budgets, you name it. And in a time of economic recession, the politically unpopular cause of caring for the severely mentally ill was almost always the first thing on the chopping block. This was the final nail in the coffin. The federal government had officially washed its hands of the problem. The dream of a community-based mental health system, envisioned by Kennedy and briefly revived by Carter, was dead. The asylums were empty. The community centers were failing. The prisons were filling up. The streets of every major American city were now home to a growing population of people tormented by voices only they could hear, fighting battles only they could see. It was a humanitarian crisis hiding in plain sight, a national disgrace born from the best of intentions. But just as this new brutal equilibrium was setting in, another revolution was quietly brewing. It wasn't happening in Congress or in state houses. It was happening in pharmaceutical labs. A new generation of psychiatric drugs was on the horizon, medications known as atypical antipsychotics. They promised to be more effective than the Thorazine-era drugs and, crucially, to come without the horrific Parkinson's-like side effects. They promised clarity without the chemical straitjacket. For a system that had failed at every other turn, socially, politically, and institutionally, this seemed like a miracle. A pill that could solve what policy could not. Was this finally the answer? The magic bullet that could make community integration a reality? Or was it just the next chapter in a long, tragic story of mistaking a treatment for a cure? The promise of a pill was intoxicating. In the mid-1950s, the arrival of chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine, felt less like a medical advancement and more like a societal deliverance. Here, finally, was a tool of science, not of architecture or restraint. It didn't require a sprawling, isolated campus or a set of leather straps. It was a small, simple tablet that could quiet the most agitated minds, that could pierce the veil of psychosis and bring a person back, if not to themselves, then at least back into the room. For the doctors and nurses walking the grim wards of state hospitals, it was a revolution. Patients who had been locked in solitary rooms for years, lost to violent outbursts or catatonic stupors, were suddenly calm. They were manageable. They could sit in the day room, they could hold a conversation. The sheer volume of human suffering seemed to turn down, from a scream to a murmur. This chemical breakthrough arrived at the perfect political moment. The public was horrified by the exposés of asylum conditions, and state governments were groaning under the immense financial burden of maintaining these cities of the sick. The institutions were failing morally and fiscally. And now, medicine offered an exit strategy. This wasn't just about treating an illness. It was about emptying the beds. It was about closing the books on a century-long failed experiment. The logic seemed irrefutable. If a pill could control the worst symptoms, then these patients no longer needed the total restrictive environment of an asylum. They could live in the community. They could be free. This idea found its ultimate champion in the highest office in the land. President John F. Kennedy had a deeply personal connection to the issue of mental disability. His own sister, Rosemary, had been lobotomized and institutionalized. He understood the hidden suffering in a way few politicians could. In 1963, in a special message to Congress, he laid out a vision that would fundamentally alter the course of mental health care in America. He called for a bold new approach, one that would replace the asylum with a network of comprehensive community mental health centers. His words were powerful, painting a picture of a future where the mentally ill would be treated not as outcasts, but as neighbors. He spoke of moving from the cold mercy of custodial care to the open warmth of community. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 was the legislative embodiment of this dream. The plan was ambitious, to build thousands of these centers across the nation. They would be the safety net. A person leaving the state hospital would be connected to their local center, where they would receive medication management, therapy, vocational training, and crisis support. It was a holistic, humane, and decentralized model. Armed with this new law and the power of psychotropic medication, the great exodus began. The massive, locked doors of the asylums began to swing open. One by one at first, and then by the thousands, patients who had spent years, even decades, inside were discharged. They were given a bottle of pills, a bus ticket, and a handshake. The asylum population, which peaked at over 500,000 people in the mid-1950s, began a dramatic and sustained decline. It looked like progress, felt like liberation. But the miracle was a mirage. The magic bullet was a blank. The first and most immediate problem was the medication itself. Thorazine and the first generation of antipsychotics were not cures. They were not precise instruments. They were chemical sledgehammers. While they could suppress hallucinations and delusions, they did so at a tremendous cost. The side effects were brutal and often permanent. Patients developed uncontrollable tremors and muscle spasms. A telltale, shuffling gait became known as the Thorazine shuffle. Many experienced a profound emotional blunting, a zombie-like state where they felt neither joy nor sorrow. They were trapped in a new kind of prison, a chemical one. The very medication that was supposed to enable their freedom often made a meaningful life impossible. Many, understandably, stopped taking it the moment they were out of supervised care. Even more catastrophic, however, was the failure of the second half of the promise, the community support. JFK's grand vision of a nationwide network of comprehensive mental health centers never materialized. The funding was authorized, but it was never fully appropriated. The Vietnam War began to consume the national budget and attention. Then, in a critical policy shift, the federal government passed responsibility for the centers to the states, which were often unwilling or unable to foot the bill. Of the 2,000 centers originally planned, less than half were ever built. And those that did exist were often little more than storefront clinics, underfunded, understaffed, and completely overwhelmed. They were equipped to handle what was called the worried well, people with mild anxiety or depression, not a tidal wave of chronically and severely ill patients released from decades of institutionalization. So the newly liberated patients found themselves in a phantom system. They were discharged from the hospital, but there was nowhere for them to go. The safety net that JFK had promised had gaping, catastrophic holes. They were told to get follow-up care at a center that didn't exist or couldn't handle their needs. They were supposed to find housing in a community that feared them and had no specialized facilities. Their families, who had often been told decades earlier to give up their loved ones to the state, were now suddenly expected to become full-time caregivers with no training and no support. This policy failure was compounded by a powerful ideological movement. Civil rights lawyers, rightly horrified by the abuses of the asylum system, began to fight in the courts for patients' rights. They argued successfully that involuntary commitment was a massive deprivation of liberty. New laws were passed that set a much higher bar for institutionalizing someone against their will. A person now had to be in imminent danger to themselves or others. This was a crucial victory for civil liberties, but it created a tragic paradox. The system was now designed to push people out of hospitals, and the legal framework made it incredibly difficult to get them back in, even when they were in the midst of a severe psychotic episode. It was the perfect storm, a push for deinstitutionalization fueled by new drugs and budget cuts, a legal system that prioritized individual liberty above all else, sometimes even above an individual's own safety, and a complete systemic failure to build the community infrastructure that was the linchpin of the entire plan. The result was not freedom. For hundreds of thousands of people, it was abandonment. They were freed from the asylum, but they were not free to a life of dignity and support. They were left to fend for themselves, struggling with debilitating illnesses and crippling medication side effects, in a society that was not prepared, and ultimately not willing to care for them. The old institution was being dismantled brick by brick. But what was rising in its place? What happens when a society tears down its flawed system of care without building a new one? Where do the most vulnerable people go when there is nowhere left to put them? The answer would redefine the landscape of America's cities, creating a new kind of institution, one without walls, one we see every single day. This new institution was the city street, the homeless shelter, the county jail. The promise of deinstitutionalization was a sun-drenched vision of community, acceptance, and recovery. The reality for hundreds of thousands of people was a nightmare of neglect, abandonment, and criminalization. The great emptying of the asylums wasn't a liberation, it was an eviction. And the safety net that was supposed to catch everyone was never actually built. The entire plan hinged on one thing: the community mental health centers. President Kennedy had envisioned a network of over 2,000 of these centers, one for every community, offering everything from inpatient care to therapy to vocational training. It was a brilliant, humane idea. But a signature on a piece of paper doesn't build a hospital. It doesn't hire a psychiatrist. It doesn't pay for medication. The initial act authorized funding, but it was up to Congress to actually appropriate the money year after year. And almost immediately, the plan began to starve. The Vietnam War began to consume the federal budget. Then, an economic recession hit. The political will to fund this massive, nationwide public health project evaporated. Of the 2,000 centers Kennedy envisioned, less than half were ever built. And those that were built were chronically underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. They were like lifeboats designed to hold 1,000 people, sent to rescue a sinking ship carrying 100,000. They were doomed from the start. The states, for their part, saw a golden opportunity. Closing a massive, crumbling state hospital saved them an enormous amount of money on upkeep, staffing, and patient care. The federal government was now supposed to be picking up the tab for community treatment through Medicare and Medicaid. So governors and state legislatures saw a chance to slash their budgets. They closed the asylums with ruthless efficiency. But the money they saved, it rarely, if ever, followed the patients back into the community. Just disappeared. It went to fixing roads, funding schools, or giving tax cuts. The most vulnerable citizens were sacrificed on the altar of fiscal responsibility. This created a vacuum, a vast, gaping hole in the fabric of society. And into this vacuum fell hundreds of thousands of people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression. This phenomenon has a clinical, academic-sounding name that hides its brutal reality: transinstitutionalization. It means across institutions. Patients weren't being freed. They were simply being moved from one type of institution to another, often one far worse and completely unequipped to handle their needs. For the elderly, the new institution was the nursing home. Thousands of geriatric patients were transferred from state hospitals to facilities designed for the physically frail, not for those with complex psychiatric conditions. Staff had no training in managing dementia-related psychosis or late-life schizophrenia. Patients were often sedated into a stupor, their mental health needs completely ignored. They were warehoused once again, just in a building with a different name. For others, the new institution was the family home. Sons and daughters, husbands and wives, were suddenly expected to become full-time caregivers for relatives with profound illnesses, with zero support. Imagine trying to manage a loved one's paranoid delusions or suicidal ideations with no training, no access to respite care, and no one to call for help. Families buckled under the strain. They burned through their savings, their relationships fractured, and their own mental health deteriorated. It was an impossible burden, unfairly placed on the shoulders of those who just wanted to help. But for the vast majority, for the ones who had no family or whose families couldn't cope, the path led somewhere else. First, it led to the streets. A man discharged from a hospital after 20 years, given a week's supply of Thorazine and a bus ticket to a city he no longer recognized. He's told to check in at a community clinic, but the address is wrong, or the clinic has a 6-month waiting list. He runs out of his medication. The voices come back. The paranoia creeps in. He can't hold a job. He can't navigate the Byzantine bureaucracy to get benefits. He gets evicted. Soon he's sleeping in a park, self-medicating with alcohol, his behavior growing more erratic. He is no longer a patient. He is now a vagrant, a public nuisance. And that is when he is transferred to the final and largest new institution, the prison system. This is the most damning legacy of deinstitutionalization. We closed our asylums and opened up jail cells. Police officers with no medical training became the de facto first responders for mental health crises. Behaviors that were once seen as symptoms of an illness, disorderly conduct, trespassing, petty theft to survive, were now seen as crimes. A schizophrenic man yelling at his own hallucinations on a street corner wasn't met by a social worker. He was met by a police officer with a nightstick and a pair of handcuffs. The numbers are staggering, and they tell a story of catastrophic failure. In the 1950s, there were over 500,000 Americans in state psychiatric hospitals. Today, that number is less than 40,000. At the same time, the number of incarcerated Americans with a serious mental illness has skyrocketed. A 2014 study revealed that there are 10 times more people with serious mental illness in our jails and prisons than in our state hospitals. Let that sink in. 10 times more. The Los Angeles County Jail, Rikers Island in New York City, the Cook County Jail in Chicago. These 3 facilities on their own are now the 3 largest providers of mental health care in the entire United States. They are our new asylums. But they are asylums without doctors, without therapy, without treatment. They are places of punishment. Inmates with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence, more likely to be put in solitary confinement, a practice known to dramatically worsen psychotic symptoms, and less likely to receive any meaningful care. They are trapped in a revolving door. They get arrested, serve their time with their illness getting worse, and are then released back to the streets with no support, where the cycle inevitably begins again. This wasn't a slow, accidental drift. It was accelerated by policy. In 1981, the Reagan administration passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. This law effectively ended the federal government's direct role in providing services for the mentally ill. It took the remaining already anemic funding for community mental health centers and converted it into block grants given to the states. States were now free to spend that money on whatever they wanted, with mental health being just one of many options. The result was predictable. The last lifeline was cut. The era of federal responsibility, the one Kennedy had tried to usher in, was over. The states were on their own, and they had already shown they were unwilling or unable to carry the burden. The consequences of these decisions, made in boardrooms and legislative chambers decades ago, are the cities we live in today. The man you see sleeping on a grate in the dead of winter, the woman you see having a heated argument with an empty bus stop, they are not just statistics. They are the human fallout of a broken promise. They are the ghosts of a system that was torn down before its replacement was ever built. They exist in a world that decided it was cheaper and easier to criminalize their illness than to treat it. The institution without walls was a prison of public space, where the sentence was to be ignored, to be feared, and to be forgotten. This tragic outcome wasn't the intention. It was the byproduct of a new revolution, one that promised a cure not in a building but in a bottle. The key that was supposed to unlock the asylum doors and simultaneously support people in the community was the miracle of psychopharmacology. We touched on Thorazine, the first-generation antipsychotic that made deinstitutionalization seem possible. But what followed was a tidal wave that would not just change psychiatry, but reshape the very definition of sadness, anxiety, and selfhood in America. The stage was set in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The community mental health centers were failing, the asylums were emptying, and a vacuum of care had been created. Into this void stepped the pharmaceutical industry, armed with a new generation of drugs and a marketing message so powerful, so simple, it would become one of the most successful public health campaigns in history. The message was this: your mental illness is not a moral failing, not a weakness of character, not a product of your past. It is a disease, a tangible biological problem. Specifically, it is a chemical imbalance in your brain. This theory was a stroke of genius. For patients, it was liberating. The shame and stigma that had clung to mental illness for centuries began to dissolve. You wouldn't blame someone for having diabetes, for needing insulin to correct a chemical imbalance in their pancreas. Why, then, would you blame someone for having depression, for needing a pill to correct a chemical imbalance of serotonin in their brain? It was a neat, tidy explanation that offered a clear, straightforward solution. For doctors, it provided a simple diagnostic and treatment model. It transformed the messy, time-consuming work of psychotherapy into the efficient, scientific-sounding practice of prescribing medication to correct a neurochemical deficit. And for the pharmaceutical companies, it was a goldmine. They began to market these new drugs not just to psychiatrists but directly to general practitioners, and eventually through television and magazine ads directly to the American public. The era of ask your doctor if this drug is right for you had begun. The commercials were masterful. They showed people once crippled by depression now laughing with their families, succeeding at work, kayaking on a sun-drenched lake. The illness was the gray before. The pill was the vibrant color after. The undisputed king of this new era was a little green and white capsule introduced in 1987, Prozac. Its active ingredient, fluoxetine, was part of a new class of drugs called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. They were believed to work by increasing the levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin in the brain, and they were marketed as being safer, with fewer side effects than the older antidepressants. But Prozac became more than a medication. It became a cultural icon. It was on the cover of Newsweek in New York Magazine. The book Prozac Nation became a bestseller, defining the angst of a generation. The drug's promise seemed to extend beyond just treating clinical depression. The psychiatrist Peter Kramer coined a term for its perceived effects in his book, Listening to Prozac: Cosmetic Psychopharmacology. He described patients who, on the drug, felt better than well. They weren't just no longer depressed. They were more confident, more assertive, more resilient, more like the person they always wanted to be. The implication was staggering. This wasn't just about restoring normal function. It was about enhancing it. The American ideals of self-improvement and reinvention had found their chemical catalyst. Millions of prescriptions were written, then tens of millions. Prozac was followed by Zoloft, Paxil, Celexa, and a host of others. The chemical imbalance theory became gospel, repeated in doctors' offices and living rooms across the country. And for many people, these drugs were genuinely life-changing. For individuals trapped in the crushing darkness of severe depression, SSRIs provided a ladder out of a pit they thought they'd never escape. They enabled people to function, to work, to engage with therapy, to live their lives again. The value of that should never be understated. But a shadow narrative began to emerge, a story told in the quiet corners of the internet, in patient support groups, and eventually, in the pages of medical journals. The simple story of the chemical imbalance was beginning to crumble under scrutiny. For one, while low serotonin can be associated with depression, science has never definitively proven that it causes it. The theory was, in large part, a hypothesis reverse-engineered from the fact that SSRIs seemed to help some people. It was a brilliant marketing message, but it was a vast oversimplification of the complex interplay of genetics, environment, trauma, and biology that leads to mental illness. Then there were the side effects, which were often more severe and widespread than initially advertised. Emotional blunting, a loss of libido, weight gain. And for a significant number of patients, the drugs simply didn't work. The most troubling discovery, however, was what happened when people tried to stop taking them. Many experienced debilitating withdrawal symptoms, dizziness, nausea, brain zaps, and a resurgence of anxiety and depression, often worse than before. The industry termed this discontinuation syndrome, a label that critics argued was a euphemism to avoid the more alarming word, addiction. Patients who had been told they were simply correcting a brain imbalance now felt trapped, tethered to a pill they couldn't easily quit. This pharmaceutical revolution was supercharged by another, equally powerful force transforming American healthcare: managed care. In the 1980s and 90s, insurance companies, desperate to control spiraling costs, began to exert immense influence over the kind of care doctors could provide. In the realm of mental health, the math was brutal and simple. A 50-minute therapy session was expensive. A 15-minute med check appointment to renew a prescription was cheap. The system began to heavily incentivize the quickest, most cost-effective solution. Psychiatry, once the domain of talk therapy and deep analysis of a patient's life and history, was reshaped by these economic pressures. The psychiatrist became, for many, a psychopharmacologist. Their primary role was to diagnose a condition based on a checklist of symptoms from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, and prescribe the appropriate medication. The nuance of a person's life story, their relationships, their stressors, all the things that talk therapy explores, were pushed to the periphery. They weren't billable in the same efficient way. So the grand vision of community-based care, the one that was supposed to replace the asylum, never truly materialized. What we got instead was a system of fragmented, medication-first treatment. The supportive housing, the vocational training, the robust outpatient therapy, the wraparound services that were the heart of the Community Mental Health Act, were deemed too expensive by a society that had moved on. The new institution wasn't a building with walls, but a system of economic incentives. It was a system that could offer a prescription for a chemical imbalance, but had little to offer the person who was unemployed, isolated, and struggling to find meaning. It was a system that could manage symptoms but often failed to heal lives. The promise of the pill was that it would free people, both from the asylum and from their illness. And for some, it did. But for millions of others, it created a new kind of dependency, not on an institution but on a chemical. It fostered a belief that the complex tapestry of human suffering could be reduced to a simple neurochemical deficit, a problem to be solved rather than a story to be understood. The asylum doors had been closed, but in their place we had built a new invisible architecture of control, one made of prescription pads, insurance policies, and a culture that increasingly sought the quickest fix for the deepest of human pains. And so, the great experiment of deinstitutionalization revealed its true, brutal cost. The promise was freedom. The reality, for hundreds of thousands, was abandonment. We didn't just empty the asylums, we transferred their populations. We moved them from state-funded wards to city streets, from padded cells to prison cells. The largest mental health providers in the United States today are not hospitals. They are jails. The Los Angeles County Jail, Rikers Island in New York, the Cook County Jail in Chicago. These have become the new asylums, devoid of even the pretense of therapeutic care. The promise of community mental health centers, the bedrock of the entire plan, was a promise built on sand. Funding was slashed almost as soon as it was allocated. The vision of a robust, local support network for every person in need evaporated, leaving a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed homelessness, addiction, and the criminal justice system. We had traded one form of neglect for another, more public, more chaotic form. The person muttering on the subway, the man sleeping in the park, the woman cycling in and out of the emergency room. They are the living legacy of a well-intentioned policy that failed in its execution. They are the ghosts of the asylum, haunting the conscience of a nation that looked away. We closed the doors on the institutions not because we had found a better way, but because we had found a cheaper way. And the human price of that decision is still being calculated every single day on our streets and in our prisons. Simultaneously, for those who could access the system, the nature of treatment itself was undergoing a revolution. The rise of Prozac in the late 1980s and the wave of SSRIs that followed didn't just change brain chemistry, they changed culture. Suddenly, mental distress was not just a problem to be managed through therapy or, in extreme cases, institutionalization. It was a chemical imbalance to be corrected. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, grew thicker with each new edition, pathologizing more and more of the human experience. Shyness became social anxiety disorder. Grief became major depressive disorder if it lasted too long. The normal spectrum of human emotion was increasingly medicalized, categorized, and assigned a corresponding pill. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a convergence of interests. Pharmaceutical companies, armed with massive marketing budgets, sold the American public a compelling story. A pill for every ill. A quick, clean scientific solution to the messy, complicated business of being human. For doctors, it offered a tangible tool in a brief 15-minute appointment. For insurance companies, it was far more cost-effective to approve a monthly prescription than to pay for long-term intensive psychotherapy. And for patients, for us, it offered hope. The hope of a simple fix, a way to silence the noise, to function in a world that demands constant performance. We embraced the chemical solution because the alternative, deep, painful, time-consuming work, seemed impossible. The prescription pad became the new gatekeeper, the pharmacist the new warden, and the chemical straitjacket, while invisible, was for some just as real. And now we stand at another precipice, in another era of profound change. The asylum has become digital. Our phones are the new waiting rooms. Therapy is delivered through an app. Our moods are tracked by algorithms, and our search for connection often leads us to online forums and social media feeds that can be both a lifeline and an echo chamber of despair. We've democratized access to mental health information in a way that was once unimaginable. You can find a therapist, a support group, a breathing exercise, all with a few taps on a screen. This has saved lives. It has broken down barriers of stigma and geography. But it has also created a new marketplace of the mind. A place where venture capital-backed startups promise wellness and deliver data mining. Where complex trauma is met with a chatbot offering generic platitudes. We've moved from padded cells to algorithm-curated feeds, and we must ask if we are simply creating a new, more personalized form of isolation. Are we trading the institution's sterile observation for the algorithm's invisible surveillance? This new frontier offers unprecedented promise, but it carries the same old risks. The dehumanization of suffering, the prioritization of profit over people, and the allure of the easy answer over the difficult truth. Yet, amidst the wreckage of old systems and the uncertain dawn of new ones, a quieter, more profound revolution is taking place. It's a shift back towards the human. It's the rise of trauma-informed care, which asks not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. It recognizes that the wounds of the mind are often intertwined with the wounds of life. It's the reemergence of psychedelic-assisted therapies, using substances like psilocybin and MDMA in controlled, therapeutic settings to unlock parts of the psyche that have been walled off by trauma. A modern scientific approach to something ancient cultures have known for millennia. It's the growing understanding of the mind-body connection, the irrefutable link between our mental health and our gut, our inflammation levels, our sleep, our nutrition. We are slowly, painstakingly beginning to see the whole person again. Not as a collection of symptoms to be medicated, but as a complex being with a story that matters. The future of mental health care may not lie in a new pill or a new app. It may lie in community, in connection, in creating a society where it is safe to be vulnerable, where asking for help is seen not as a weakness, but as the ultimate act of strength. It lies in building the robust, well-funded, accessible community support networks that were promised half a century ago. The history of the asylum in America is not a story of monsters and villains. It is a story of us. It is a story of good intentions paving the road to hell. It is a story of scientific hubris, of societal fear, and of our profound, enduring struggle to understand the most complex thing in the known universe, the human mind. The stone walls of Kirkbride and the abandoned wards of Penhurst are not just relics of a bygone era. They are mirrors. They reflect our own capacity for both profound compassion and terrifying indifference. They remind us that any system we build, no matter how modern or technologically advanced, is only as good as the empathy that underpins it. The journey from the asylum's shadow is not over. We are still walking it. The challenge is no longer about tearing down walls of brick and mortar, but about dismantling the invisible walls in our own minds. The walls of stigma, of fear, of misunderstanding. The challenge is to build a system that doesn't just manage illness, but fosters genuine wellness. A system that honors the dignity, the complexity, and the humanity of every single person it touches. The ghosts of the asylum will always be with us, but they don't have to define our future. We can choose to learn from them. We can choose to finally, at long last, build the world of care we were always meant to.